I was exhausted by it, and I thought, wow, when I do stand-up, I have to go there. If I do a movie, I stay home and the movie goes there.
Steve Martin just turned 80, and he's not holding back. The comedy legend is sharper than ever and ready to spill some fake but juicy tea. In a totally made-up interview, he listed 6 actors who drove him crazy on set. From awkward fights to silent feuds, this burn book is wild. Let's jump into the chaos. Number 6. Chevy Chase. They may have worn sombreros together, but off-screen, ice cold. When Three Amigos came out in the 1980s, people thought Steve Martin, Chevy Chase, and Martin Short had great chemistry. They looked like a fun group on screen. Everyone laughed and thought they must be close friends in real life too. But the truth behind the scenes was very different, especially between Steve and Chevy. Things were not smooth between them. Steve was calm and serious about his work. He showed up prepared. He learned his lines and followed the plan. Chevy liked to go off script. He would change lines on the spot. He made up new jokes during scenes. Sometimes those jokes worked. Other times, they made it hard for his co-stars to deliver their lines. People said Chevy liked to make every scene about himself. Someone from the crew once joked that Chevy treated scripts like suggestions. He would walk onto the set and decide what he thought was funnier. If Steve had a funny line, Chevy might interrupt. If Martin Short had a moment, Chevy would try to get a bigger laugh. It became a problem during filming. Steve never yelled or started fights, but he let people know when he wasn't happy. He was known for his sarcastic humor, and he used it to get his point across. One line that fans love to repeat is this: "If ego was currency, Chevy could bail out Wall Street." That may not be something Steve actually said, but it sure sounds like him. At the time, Chevy was already a big star. He had been on Saturday Night Live. He had done Fletch and National Lampoon's Vacation. He was used to getting his way. He often bragged about his past work. He liked to remind people how famous he was. That attitude made things tense on set. People said he acted like he was the main character, even when the movie had 3 leads. Steve and Martin tried to keep things professional. Martin Short was still new to big Hollywood movies. He focused on doing a good job. Steve saw how well Martin worked with others, and some say he wanted Martin to get more screen time. Not to be mean to Chevy, but to balance things out. When Chevy went off track, Martin brought things back. During filming, there were moments where Chevy would argue with the director. He gave opinions about every scene. If he didn't like something, he made it known. If a joke didn't land, he blamed the writing. He even complained about his costume. There's a story that he once refused to shoot a scene because he thought his sombrero looked silly. The director tried to stay patient. Steve and Martin did too, but it wasn't easy. At one point, Chevy gave a long speech at the wrap party. He thanked himself a lot. He barely mentioned his co-stars. Steve, standing nearby with a drink in his hand, just raised his eyebrows and smiled. He didn't say anything out loud, but people around him got the message. Even after the movie came out, Steve didn't talk much about working with Chevy. He stayed quiet in interviews. He praised the film and the fans. He avoided saying anything negative about his co-stars. Martin Short also stayed polite. He once said the experience was energetic, which many people think was his way of saying, "Difficult, but I survived." Chevy never admitted there were problems. He likely thought everything went fine. He always seemed confident in what he did. That may have been part of the issue. People who worked with him often said the same thing. Chevy believed he was the funniest person in the room, no matter who else was there. Later in his career, Steve worked with Martin Short many times. They did stage shows and comedy specials. They starred in Only Killings in the Building together. Their friendship got stronger with time. Steve never teamed up with Chevy again. Some say that was a choice. Maybe Steve preferred working with people who didn't try to steal every scene. Maybe he just liked calm sets and clear direction. It's hard to know exactly what happened all those years ago. Everyone has their own version of the story. But one thing is clear. Steve Martin and Chevy Chase were very different people. One liked structure. The other liked chaos. That mix can be fun to watch on screen, but it's not always fun to live through during a long movie shoot. Even today, fans still love Three Amigos. The movie became a classic. People quote the lines, wear the costumes, and laugh at the jokes. But behind the laughs, there was stress. There were clashing styles. There were long days and quiet sighs. And in those moments, Steve likely decided that working with Chevy once was enough. But if you think Chevy was tough to work with, wait until you hear about the Hollywood legend who kept showing up late and throwing Steve's whole routine off track. Number 5. Goldie Hawn. Goldie Hawn and Steve Martin starred together in the early 1990s romantic comedy House Sitter. On screen, they had great chemistry. They played off each other's energy and made the story fun to watch. Goldie brought her signature charm, and Steve played the straight man with perfect timing. But while the audience saw a sweet and funny story unfold, the real story behind the scenes was a little more stormy. At first, things seemed fine. Goldie was full of energy and always had the room smiling. She joked with the crew, shared stories, and kept the mood light. But once filming started, her approach to the work clashed with Steve's. Steve was serious about preparation. He liked to rehearse scenes multiple times. He memorized every line, studied every beat, and respected the script like a sacred document. Goldie, on the other hand, was more relaxed. She liked to improvise and change things up as she went. This caused problems during filming. Steve would come in ready to hit his marks and deliver each line exactly as written. But Goldie often changed the rhythm. She would say new lines or respond in a way that threw off the timing. Steve's carefully planned delivery wouldn't land the same way if the setup was different. It frustrated him. Even worse, if a joke didn't get a laugh, Goldie reportedly blamed the scene partner, meaning Steve. She also had a habit of showing up late. Not extremely late, but just enough to throw off the day's schedule. When a movie is shooting, timing matters. Every minute counts. Steve valued that. He arrived early, stayed focused, and wanted to wrap on time. Goldie's delays added tension. Some crew members noticed Steve growing quiet on those days. He didn't complain openly, but the stress showed in small ways. One story that kept making the rounds happened at a cast party during filming. Someone handed Goldie a microphone, and she started telling stories. Then she made a joke about Steve's banjo playing. Everyone laughed. It seemed harmless, but those close to Steve said he didn't appreciate it. He took his banjo work seriously. It was more than a hobby. Goldie likely meant it as a light joke, but it stuck with him. Despite all this, Steve remained professional. He didn't argue with Goldie on set. He didn't yell or walk off scenes. He kept doing his job. But people who were there said he often looked tired after filming. They described him as drained and tense by the end of the shoot. Goldie was charming in public, but backstage, things weren't as smooth. After House Sitter, fans expected them to work together again. The movie wasn't a huge hit, but it gained a following. Studios looked at both stars and thought they could reunite in another comedy. A few scripts were even discussed. But Steve said no. Quietly, without causing a stir, he made it clear he didn't want another project with Goldie. One producer later hinted that Steve had turned down a sequel-type idea because he didn't want to go through that again. Over time, Steve worked with many actresses in comedy. He praised Diane Keaton. He loved working with Queen Latifah. He formed strong partnerships with people who shared his work style. Goldie didn't make that list. He never said anything cruel about her in public. He kept it classy. But when asked in later interviews about House Sitter, he usually changed the subject or kept his answers short. Goldie, for her part, continued doing well. She starred in other films, did interviews, and stayed active in Hollywood. If she noticed Steve's cold shoulder, she never brought it up. She talked about House Sitter once or twice, but focused on the fun parts. It's possible she never realized the impact of those late arrivals or those off-the-cuff jokes. Still, when people close to Steve are asked who he had a hard time working with, Goldie's name comes up. Not because of one big fight or a huge scandal, but because of small things that added up. Steve valued structure, focus, and respect for the team's time. Goldie brought a more spontaneous style that didn't always fit with his. That mix didn't create the smoothest working environment. Even today, House Sitter is remembered fondly. It has its fans. The comedy still holds up for many people. But behind those funny scenes was a quiet clash. One side brought sunshine and spark. The other brought planning and precision. They made it work on camera, but off camera, they went in very different directions. Steve Martin never worked with Goldie Horn again, and based on how he handled things, it's safe to say he never wanted to. Steve's troubles with unpredictable co-stars didn't end there. Next up was a comedy superstar whose wild energy made even the calmest sets feel like a three-ring circus. Number 4. Jim Carrey. Steve Martin and Jim Carrey could have been a comedy dream team. Both had wild energy, sharp timing, and massive fan bases. But according to whispers in Hollywood, they clashed harder than cymbals at a marching band parade. It all began at a comedy awards show in the early 2000s. Jim was getting honored, and in true Carrey style, he walked on stage and gave a 14-minute acceptance speech. He did impressions, shouted random words, and even crawled on the floor at one point. Some laughed, some clapped. But Steve yawned, loudly, on purpose. Then he walked on the stage holding a giant cardboard sign that just said, "Wrap it up." That moment made headlines. People thought it was part of the act, but insiders claim it wasn't. Steve had been annoyed the whole night. He was supposed to present the final award, but Jim's marathon speech threw everything off. Backstage, Steve allegedly said, "He's what happens when improvisation becomes a disorder." The tension didn't end there. Years later, when producers were organizing a big comedy roast for a legendary director, they wanted both Steve and Jim on the lineup. Steve refused, flat out. Said he wouldn't share a stage with someone who, in his words, treats comedy like a bouncy castle no one asked for. Things between them were never the same again. At industry parties, Steve would leave early if Jim showed up. At one party, Jim was doing his usual thing, spinning a drink tray on his finger while pretending to be a French mime. And Steve reportedly walked past him and muttered, "Please get therapy." Their biggest near collaboration came when they were both considered for a buddy cop comedy in the mid-2000s. Steve read the script, liked the concept, but when he heard Jim was already attached, he passed. Told his agent, "There's no air left when he's in the room." The root of their clash may have come from how differently they approach comedy. Steve is precise. He plans every beat, every gesture, every line. Jim is wild. He dives into chaos and finds the funny in the unexpected. That kind of creative energy doesn't always mix well, especially when one man is doing silent, dry comedy and the other is pretending to be a dolphin on roller skates. On the set of a charity sketch show, the two were briefly forced to work together. The script was tight. The cast was all-star, but things fell apart in rehearsal. Jim kept improvising. Steve kept stopping him. One crew member claimed they rehearsed a 2-minute sketch for over 3 hours, and it still didn't land. Steve walked off before filming. Jim stayed and performed it solo. The show edited around the awkwardness, but fans noticed Steve's absence. Jim never publicly spoke against Steve, but in one interview, when asked which comedian he found a little too uptight, he smiled and said, "Let's just say not everyone who plays a banjo is playing it for fun." Despite all this, both men have continued to thrive. Steve moved into more thoughtful comedy and drama. Jim took a darker, more artistic path with roles in serious films. But the gap between them never closed. Some fans hoped for a surprise reunion at a recent Netflix comedy special celebrating old-school legends. Steve was on the guest list. So was Jim. But Steve canceled last minute. One source claims he heard Jim had a front-row seat and said, "I'll watch it on TV. At least I can mute him." To this day, they remain two of comedy's most iconic names. But put them in the same room, and the energy shifts fast. One wants silence and subtle smirks, the other wants chaos and rubber faces. And that, as Steve might say, isn't a duet, it's a car crash in clown shoes. The feud may not be public, no yelling matches, no wild tweets, but it's there, quiet, icy, long-lasting, and honestly, it might be one of the funniest serious rivalries in Hollywood. Because only in the world of comedy could two geniuses fight over a punchline and never agree on who got it right. You might think Jim's chaotic style was hard to handle, but Steve's next clash involved flying bread rolls and a co-star who treated every moment like her own personal concert. Number 3. Bette Midler. They were supposed to be the perfect comedy duo for a charity gala back in the 90s. Steve Martin, the king of dry humor. Bette Midler, the queen of big laughs and bigger vocals. On paper, it sounded great. But backstage, it was pure chaos. Steve thought they were co-hosting. Bette acted like she was the main act. The moment the lights came up, she was already working the crowd like she was headlining a Vegas show. Steve could barely finish a sentence before Bette launched into a surprise musical number. People close to the event said Bette changed the plan on the spot. Instead of their agreed script, she started adding jokes, jabs, and jazzy songs without warning. At one point, she sang over Steve's closing monologue completely unrehearsed. No heads up, no cue. Just her voice soaring over Steve's soft, sarcastic punchlines. Steve smiled through it all. That polite, frozen smile people give when they're seconds away from walking out. And walk out, he did. Right after the show ended, Steve left without saying goodbye. He didn't stick around for photos, interviews, or even the post-event dinner. But the real drama happened backstage. According to a crew member who later spilled the beans, Bette got upset when Steve didn't thank her on stage. She reportedly started throwing bread rolls at his head in the green room, not out of hate, but out of playful fury. Still, bread is bread, and carbs were flying. Bette shouted something about being left hanging, while Steve quietly ducked behind a chair. One crew member tried to break the tension by offering more dinner rolls, but Steve simply picked up his coat and walked out. Later that night, When the event team checked donation slips, they noticed a large anonymous check. But Steve didn't leave it without a note. His message reportedly said, "Tell Bet it came from her biggest fan." Silence. That line spread through Hollywood faster than a red carpet rumor. It was cold, clever, and classic Steve. Friends say it was his way of staying classy without letting Bet off the hook. The gala should have been a highlight of the year. Instead, it became one of those awkward Hollywood stories whispered about at other events. Anytime Steve saw Bet's name on a guest list, he'd make sure his name disappeared. Years later, producers tried to reunite them for a comedy roundtable. Bet said yes. Steve said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence said more than any roast or joke ever could. Some people close to Steve say the clash with Bet hit a nerve because he really respected her. That might be what stung the most. He came in expecting teamwork, timing, and mutual respect. What he got was a one-woman show with backup dancers he didn't ask for. And to make it worse, Betty started mocking his style in interviews afterward. She once joked that Steve had the energy of a tired librarian and the punchlines of a dad stuck in traffic. Steve didn't fire back publicly, but insiders say he quietly pulled out of a planned comedy film where Betty was rumored to star. The project went ahead without him. It flopped. Steve never mentioned it again. To this day, fans still wonder what could have been if Bet and Steve actually teamed up in a movie. But after that gala, the odds dropped to 0. Steve never talked about the feud openly, but a few years later, during an interview, he gave a strange piece of advice. Never co-host with someone who can out-sing you, out-talk you, and outshine you in 3-inch heels. He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. What's wild is that Betty still speaks kindly about him now and then. She once called him a brilliant clown with the soul of a poet. But behind the scenes, the tension still lingers. One of those classic Hollywood cases where the smile is wide but the history is sharp. Even in comedy, not every duo is meant to make magic. Some partnerships explode in laughter. Others end with a bread roll flying across a green room and a man in a white suit heading for the exit. That night proved something Steve learned the hard way. Sometimes the loudest voices don't always leave room for a quiet genius. Think bread-throwing drama was intense? Steve's next story involves a comedy genius so fast and unpredictable that working with him felt like being caught in a creative hurricane. Number 2. Robin Williams. Steve Martin never denied that Robin Williams was a genius. He had the brain of a poet and the energy of a 5-year-old on sugar. But even for someone like Steve, who could match wits with the sharpest comedians in the room, working with Robin felt like getting caught in a tornado made of impressions, sound effects, and lightning-fast jokes. They were never enemies, but Steve reportedly found Robin more exhausting than entertaining when it came to working together. He respected the man, loved the laughs, and even called him a once-in-a-lifetime performer. Still, according to people close to both of them, Steve would politely decline any group event where Robin's name showed up. It wasn't bitterness, it was survival. One story goes back to a charity event in the early 1990s. Steve and Robin were supposed to perform a short sketch. Simple, clean, 4 pages. Just 2 legends doing what they do best. But once the lights hit the stage, Robin went full rocket ship. The bit exploded into a long, loud, barely scripted improv routine. Steve's carefully timed lines got drowned in sound effects, voices, and unexpected turns. By the time they walked off, Steve's expression said it all. He reportedly muttered backstage, "Trying to perform with Robin is like trying to read poetry on a roller coaster." And no one argued. Steve was known for his love of control. He liked rehearsals. He liked timing. He believed in structure and rhythm. Robin, on the other hand, was the human version of jazz. No rules, no script, just whatever his brain came up with in the moment. That contrast made for great entertainment, but also quiet frustration. Steve could never predict what Robin would do next, and not in a fun way. Another insider said the tension started years earlier at a comedy benefit dinner. Robin was doing a 10-minute set. He ran well past it. The audience was still laughing, but producers backstage were getting nervous. Steve, who was supposed to go on next, finally walked on stage holding a giant cardboard clock. He didn't say a word. He just pointed to it. Robin grinned, gave him a hug, and kept going for 5 more minutes. Steve never made a scene, but those who knew him say he avoided working with Robin whenever he could after that. It wasn't personal. He just didn't want to be a prop in someone else's chaos. They did cross paths again at a major Hollywood roast. Steve was invited as a surprise speaker, but when he heard Robin would be emceeing, he backed out. No press release, no drama, just a polite scheduling conflict. But insiders say the real reason was Robin's unpredictable style. Steve wanted structure, not surprise singing or random audience impressions. Despite it all, there was no hate in Steve's voice when he ever talked about Robin. In fact, he reportedly called him an explosion of pure creative force. But even fireworks can be overwhelming when you're standing too close. Their relationship was never cold, just complicated. Steve admired Robin's mind, but hated how unpredictable he made things. It wasn't about ego. Steve just didn't like his work being steamrolled by someone who didn't know how to slow down. Robin once joked in an interview that working with Steve felt like being in school. "He's the teacher. I'm the hyper kid in the back with a kazoo," he said, laughing. Steve never replied publicly, but friends say he didn't deny it. Even years later, when tributes poured in for Robin after his passing, Steve posted a simple message. No long story, no behind-the-scenes tale, just a brilliant man, a kind soul, and a comic flame that burned too fast. It was clear that deep down, there was a lot of love. But love doesn't always make good comedy partners. Some say the reason Steve never tried to work with Robin again was because he knew he couldn't control him. And Steve liked being in control, on stage, in scripts, in timing. With Robin, there was none of that. Every moment was a wild card. Still, even if their professional chemistry fizzled, the respect never left. Steve admired Robin for what he was, a rare, raw, restless performer who made everything unpredictable. They were two sides of the same comedy coin, one smooth and structured, the other wild and loud. And sometimes those two don't mix. But even Robin's tornado of energy couldn't compare to Steve's biggest feud of all. This final clash was so cold it lasted over a decade and involved blazer insults that still sting today. Number 1. Bill Sray. Out of all the feuds Steve Martin may or may not have had in Hollywood, the one with Bill Murray was the loudest, and possibly the frostiest. These two comedy icons clashed hard during a Saturday Night Live reunion in the mid-1980s. On the surface, it looked like a celebration. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. It started with Bill showing up late. Not just 10 minutes, almost an hour. Steve was already dressed, rehearsed, and ready to go. Bill came strolling in like it was a backyard barbecue, not a national broadcast. He didn't just arrive late. He walked in, took one look at Steve's sharp blazer, and called it comfort comedy for bored accountants. That set the tone. Steve, always the polished professional, tried to keep things moving. But Bill was on a different wavelength. During the live sketch they were supposed to do together, Bill started ad-libbing every single line. He skipped entire jokes, ignored cues, and spun scenes in weird directions. It left Steve standing on stage like a confused high school drama teacher. Viewers may not have noticed the full chaos, but the crew did. The writers definitely did. And Steve? He was not amused. Backstage, things got even colder. Steve reportedly told Lorne Michaels, "Next time, book a mime instead." That line floated around the studio for days. Everyone felt the tension. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, slow, and sharp, like ice cracking beneath your feet. They didn't speak after that show. Not a call, not a nod, not even a joke sent through a mutual friend. 13 years passed. Hollywood saw plenty of reunions in that time, but never Steve and Bill. If their names popped up on the same guest list, someone always made a scheduling switch. Then came the Cannes Film Festival. They were both invited to the same dinner. The table was long, the wine was flowing, and the tension was thick. They sat at opposite ends, surrounded by assistants, publicists, and a few brave actors who thought maybe the Cold War had thawed. It hadn't. Reports say they didn't speak at all. When communication had to happen, it went through assistants. Steve asked for sparkling water. An assistant passed the message. Bill responded with a nod. The whole evening played out like a high-stakes family reunion. Two funny uncles refusing to look at each other. Friends tried to step in. Martin Short cracked jokes to lighten the mood. Chevy Chase wandered over and tried to start a group story. Even Tom Hanks leaned in at one point with a smile and a bottle of wine. Nothing worked. Steve stayed quiet. Bill leaned back and talked to anyone but him. Years later, when Steve was asked about that Cannes moment, he smiled and changed the subject. Bill, for his part, told someone at a party that Steve was too polite to punch. That's about as close to a compliment as it ever got. No one really knows if they ever patched things up. Maybe they ran into each other at another gala. Maybe someone passed them both a script and they shook hands. Or maybe they're still holding the silence like two chess players waiting for the other to move. Whatever happened after that sketch, it left a dent. A long, silent, blazer-insulting dent. And if Steve's imaginary burn book had a gold cover, Bill Murray's name would be on page 1. Steve Martin might be 80, but his legendary silence still hits harder than a mic drop. These behind-the-scenes stories show just how sharp, sarcastic, and surgical his comedy instincts really are. If you loved this fake Hollywood burn book, hit like, subscribe, and tell us, who should Steve silently shade next?